Good evening, everyone. Good evening, APEN members. It's nice to have you all on board again today. So the first webinar of the third term of the 2021-2022 school session. I'm sure that you have all resumed on a good note and you're all set to give and get the best from our schools, our various schools this term. The webinar today is not an unfamiliar topic to us. It's a topic that we know has been long awaited. We shall be talking about trauma, crisis, safety of our students. We know that the question has never really been about if there'll be trauma, but when there will be trauma. So it's very important. It has become even more so these days in view of the latest trends and the latest occurrences, that we all equip ourselves with all the tools and ammunition for crisis, for trauma, and for any other unknown incidents that may come our way. We're thankful under the able leadership of Mrs. Koiki, our chairman, who is always pushing for one webinar or the other. She's always wanting us to get informed and be equipped. So thank you, Mrs. Koiki, for yet again another session. She has put this together. We have an excellent panel of experts in the house today that are going to be sharing with us and enlightening and empowering us some more on how to navigate the tides in our different schools and through the course of this term. So without further ado, I'm going to call on our chairman, Mrs. Lai Koiki, to give the opening address, and then we'll move on straight into the session for today. So Mrs. Koiki.
Thank you.
Mrs. Koiki, please.
Thank you. Good evening. Well, Honorable Commissioner, I'm not sure she's in yet, but then we'll greet her in absentia for making this happen as well. Good evening, Mrs. Adefisayo. A good day to our distinguished panelists and subject experts. I know they've come from as far as the US and Nigeria to share with us today. And a very good evening to our great school owners and educators. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all once again to this webinar on child safety and crisis management, which, as Mrs. Sadeo Wole has said, is something that has become extremely necessary in our climate. So many things are happening in our schools, even around us. And you know what? In Africa, we believe that it takes a village to raise a child. So this webinar is meant to empower us so that we can also empower our community, which would involve our parents. Because this is not a job that we can do all by ourselves. It takes the tripod, you know, the school, the home, the society, and everyone to bring up these precious children that are in our care. We need to understand our responsibilities, and we also need to be aware of all that we're up against. These children are exposed to so much, and it will indeed take the whole village to raise them up. As we're all aware, the world itself took a turn with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. The ripple effects are evident from our recent experiences in various schools, including your school, published and unpublished. The reality is that a lot is happening to these children in and out of the school environment. And of course, in schools, we end up having to mop up some of these issues. I personally refer to these children as an endangered species. They are endangered. A lot is being thrown at them through the internet and by the society. Unfortunately, the primary caregivers, that's the home, are also caught in the same web. So really, we all need one another. This webinar will help us to focus on solutions. We need to have a better understanding of what is actually happening to the children and what we can do to minimize the collateral damage. Our responsibilities in keeping them safe when they're in our care, and our prayers and empowerment, even of their families, when they are safe, even at home. This obviously means that all our own team members will have to take their responsibility seriously and be trained. We are as strong as our weakest link. So the panelists today will also help us focus on understanding how to communicate. That is, what to say or not say when crisis happens, whenever it occurs. Well, we must know that these problems will not go away, not in a hurry. They're not going away because the world itself is full of all sorts of issues. So all we can do is to evolve processes that will help us manage them such that they do not escalate. So I now leave you in the hands of our specialist, ably led by Dr. Bukola Ogunkwa, a medical doctor and a trauma specialist. The team will share information on the emotional impact of adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, domestic violence, divorce, traumatic death, and all sorts of issues. And they're going to share this through the lens of research. So what they're sharing with us is not, hearsay or anything like that. It is based on research. And to also let us know how these children behave to cope with all the challenges that they have encountered in life. and how schools can transition from crisis to a climate of and culture of total wellness. It's actually not just schools, it's the society itself. And I believe they'll share with us how societies have been transformed or are in the process of being transformed. So, I mean, right now, I will leave you in the hands of our experts. And I will ask you all sort of fasten your seatbelt, so to say, and just be ready to drink from their well of experiences. So I'll hand you over now to Dr. Ogunkwa. Dr. Ogunkwa, please, can you take the stage? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Ms. Adewale was to be the
introduction. Yes, we're going to make the introductions. Thank you so much.
Okay, go ahead. Yes, okay. Then.
Thank you so much, our able chairman, Mrs. Lai Koiki, for that brief welcome address. So next we have the panel sessions that will start now. So the order of events for today, the panelists are going to have their presentations first. And once they're done with their presentations, we'll have a question and answer session whereby the panelists are going to be answering our questions one after the other. And what Dr. Ogunkwa has requested is that we should please note the names of the speakers specifically that would like to ask questions. So I'll start with very brief introductions of each of the panelists that we have today. First, as we know, the lead is Dr. Bukola Ogunkwa. She's a physician, a child trauma expert, and a licensed professional counseling psychologist who has leveraged her training in medicine, public health, human services, management, and counseling to create a successful national and international child behavioral practice in the US. She is very current about child trauma situations, and she loves gardening. She likes learning new languages and spending time with her family in her free time. Dr. Ogunkwa is married and has 3 children and 4 grandchildren. You're welcome, Dr. Ogunkwa.
Thank you.
Next we have, you're welcome. Next we have Mrs. Adejoke Ogunlewe. Mrs. Adejoke Ogunlewe is a result-driven, goal-oriented legal practitioner and business consultant with over a decade of experience in combined advisory and litigation practice. She's a barrister at law, and she graduated from the Olabisi Onabanjo University, Agro Iwoye, and has a master's in law from the University of Lagos. Her area of expertise includes business formation, legal and regulatory advisory for startups, non-governmental and non-profit organizations, and others. She's married to Adetola Ogunlewe, Esquire, and we have Mr. H. Gene Wright II. Mr. H. Gene Wright II is a transformational, highly experienced and professionally trained clinical and forensic psychologist with over 20 years of experience in behavioral health and proven success in passionately leading people and managing projects and initiatives in government, private practice, as well as she's also an academician and an assistant professor and clinical faculty for Temple University. Dr. Wright is highly sought out and in demand clinically, and is a forensic psychologist who is an accomplished wellness and mental boundary removal expert. Oh, wow, that's a lot. And he likes using the Wright method. So the Wright is in his name, WRIGH, Wright method. And this has endeared him to many throughout the nation. So Dr. Jin is based in the US. And the last but not the least that we have is Reverend Donna Lawrence Jones. Reverend Dr. L. Jones has been a restorative practitioner, trainer, author, and advocate for over 2 decades. Dr. Jones serves as Executive Director of the Metropolitan Christian Council of Philadelphia, a church foundation that resources nonprofits, grassroots community leaders, and congregations involved in the education of persons living in low-wealth neighborhoods through its Mabel Kuhn and Walter S. Kuhn Memorial Trust. Donna has been married to Mr. Kim Jones for over 40 years, and they have been blessed with 4 biological children and their families, and 2 foster sons, Gregory Payne, who is deceased, and Gary Ruffin. Thank you all so much. You're welcome. I don't know if the Honorable Commissioner is here yet, but we also have our Honorable Commissioner for Education, Lagos State. She's also going to be speaking. She's one of the panelists. She's going to share with us the Lagos State involvement and how we can all align with our own national laws around us in order to keep ourselves protected and safeguarded. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Ogunkwa to please proceed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Adewale, and thank you all for having us. It's a pleasure to connect via this technology, and we look forward to coming into Nigeria soon. I usually am home 3 times a year, supporting, training, doing what I can to share this knowledge of child trauma with anyone who cares to listen. Mrs. Koiki has been gracious to have her center as our Center for Trauma. And we have another center in Shagamu, the Redeemers College for Ogun State and beyond. Today I stand in 2 roles, the role of the CEO of Suburban Cares, which is 2 nonprofits together, as well as a member of a team which Dr. Jean Wright and Dr. Donna Jones are part of. We, Dr. Jean and myself, tend to joke with each other that we're Dr. Donna Jones's disciples, and we truly meant that word, not only because she's a reverend, but because she is one of the leaders of social justice in the US. And she has designed restorative cities, which has helped cities of Baltimore, Chicago, and many more. She'll tell you her story when she's on, and Philadelphia. And so you have a lot to learn. I like the way Mrs. Koiki introduced that adage of it takes a village. What saddens me is that the village no longer exists. And we now have children suffering because of it. And the suffering, unfortunately, goes unrecognized, not because we are not caring people, but because we're unaware and so many times ignorant of what our children are going through and what they're exhibiting. This work started with Mrs. Adefisayo in 2009 when she was principal of Corona School. And at that time, she invited me to help, and I'm very happy that we did work for 3 years in Corona, and from there decided to spread it across the nation as best as we could to share with schools the stressors that children are going through and the impact that it would have. Now, fast forward 2009 to 2019, that's a long time of distress that children have gone through. And now we're getting the result of what I was worried about, that our children get injured, unresolved, use adaptive behaviors, which are maladaptive and bizarre in some instances, to the point that they're now getting to impairment. Many are now mentally ill. They're just not diagnosed. And those who you are seeing now with this sensational social media posts when unfortunate incidences happen in your schools are part of their own way of coping. So my hope today is that this very short, because an hour and 30 minutes is a really short time to really walk through this issue. The work of Dr. Donna Jones takes, just to introduce in the universities where we do go, it takes 3 full days to do introduction. So to talk about this in 90 minutes is just to just give you topics. This is what you need, this is what you need, but it's not going to be enough. So my hope is that schools will open themselves to more trainings to become trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, and over time become trauma-competent. Because if you don't, we're sitting on a keg of gunpowder. Unfortunately, the fuse has been lit by events and things that's happening to our children. And it's just a matter of when. It's not if, it's a matter of when it's going to happen in your school. Unfortunately, like Mrs. Koiki said, you are the receivers of things that has happened outside your school, sometimes exacerbated in your schools, sometimes happening very rarely, but happening in some of the schools. And when it does happen, now we have children that their struggles are exposed. So let's go through basically what we're going to do today. Ms. Koike has gone through all the learning objectives I hope that you will accomplish today. But I want us to ask ourselves these questions. Do we really know the difference between child safeguarding and child protection? The document you have from the Domestic and Sexual Violence Response Team is a fantastic document, very well put together and very well written. But I hope that you're not filing it away, that you are daily looking at it, and that you have designated officers whose full-time work, whose full-time job is to focus on this issue to avoid what you have seen when the things now blow up. We're going to, I'm also wondering if we're really going to commit to developing, sustaining safeguarding roles as teachers, parents, guardians, and school owners. Because until we collectively develop these roles into very active and collaborative form, we will still be in a lot of trouble. And are we willing to explore and integrate trauma-informed practices in our schools? They would help alleviate a lot of the problems that children have gone through when they're home. They will help prevent issues that we're having now that is now news. And the reason is this: relationship is the foundation for which children learn. If a child feels that the teacher doesn't like him or her, they cannot learn. Same thing with children at home. If the relationship between the parents and they're not secure, attachment does not occur. And so this child is just floating. And these relationships, they can hurt. As you can see in this cartoon, each time we come in with this aggressive, painful verbal abuse, which many people don't realize it hurts. The idea that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words doesn't, it's false. Words hurt. Sticks and stones hurt. Sexual abuse kills the soul. When this happens, children go into defensive survival mode. But there's still that innate sense to belong. So now the child is now forced also to seek your attention, your love. And when we are called unavailable, then now you have this motivational conflict that's going on of these two defensive systems in the child, which in itself is not helpful. Child safety is a basic need issue, and we must consider it as such. Physiological needs, food, water, shelter is important. We tend to miss rest for children. They go to school. After school, there's lesson. After lesson, there's intracurricular activity. Their life is go, 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 go. And in so doing, there's no time for their brain to reset. They're pulled and stressed by so many factors. And then there's also the sense of feeling safe. A child that doesn't feel safe, a child that doesn't feel connected, is a child that is unable to learn. So it's imperative that we focus on child safety, or we would be creating problems. Safeguarding is like primary prevention in public health. do no harm. At all costs, prevent children being exposed to child maltreatment. Child protection is secondary prevention. Harm has occurred, but we're now trying to contain it, and prevent impairment. And it refers to those activities that we do, incident reporting, ensuring that everybody knows, and that step by step, we go through the things that we need to do to make sure first that that child is safe, that that child's confidentiality is protected. And then all the reporting that comes with reporting to the law enforcement, reporting to the school system, reporting to child protective services. But our primary goal in safeguarding is to prevent impairment of health and development, so that our children can grow up in places that they feel safe, that they feel secure, that they feel that they're receiving care, they're being listened to, they're given opportunities for choices. And actions that we take to enable children to have the best possible outcomes is what safeguarding is all about. This data is by the Australian Childhood Foundation, and it's something that we have always known in child trauma, that children rarely, 98% of the time, rarely lie about disclosing sexual assault. And the reason is simple. It is a very, very painful experience that many of them even lose the language or the voice to the words to explain what happened. The replaying of the event in their head prevents them from even talking about it in the first place. And so they rarely want to talk about it. So if they do tell you somebody touched me, somebody raped me, 98% of the time, it is true. Believe them. And this research was by Dimfa and House since 1990. Also, 95% of sexual abuse is perpetrated by people, offenders that the child knows at one point or the other. It's usually people they're familiar with, people they trust, people they know. Very rarely is it that it's a stranger or an outsider.
Oh, okay.
Also, the research from Australia Bureau of Statistics says that 1 in 3 adults will not believe children if they disclosed. 1 in 3 will not believe them. So you see why children don't even come out in the first place, because they already know they're not going to be believed, or they're afraid of the consequences. And in many cases, the perpetrator has sworn them to an oath of secrecy, that if they say something, something would happen to them or to members of their family. So all that combined is why you don't have many children talk about what happened to them. So let's go into why we must safeguard children's safety, where we must ensure that children are safe. Adverse childhood experiences is a study that was done in 1998 by Drs. Anda and Feletti. And this research is showing us so many things that helps us better understand that things in the children's environment, the house, this is the home, when you say household dysfunction. If the first study was about 10 issues, now they have expanded one. But this study and the one we've conducted in Nigeria since 2016 has been on just these 10 issues. What is going on in the home greatly impacts the child. If mother is treated violently, domestic violence. Not that children don't feel when fathers are treated violently or there's domestic violence committed by mother, but this study was just on women being treated violently. If there's substance use in the home, especially alcohol and all the street drugs. Divorce, and we know what happens before divorce, there's a lot of acrimony, separation, and all the back and forth for the children. Mental illness by a family member takes a toll on the kids. If a family member is in jail or has police issues. The two other categories are intrapersonal things, things that happen to the child directly. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect. Neglect in Nigeria, from what we have seen, are inadvertent. That is, parents are working too long hours. Unavailable, many children are raised by housemates, nannies, and drivers. That in itself is neglect, because these are paid workers that really don't have most of the time direct interest on these kids. They need to make their money go to their homes. And many of the injuries that many children have reported to us have occurred on the watch of the people we give them to. So we're going to look at a lot of things from the research. But before we go into it, I just want to share this few slides from the ACEs Connection. And I'll leave the link at the end of the session so you can go there. It is important that a lot of people take advantage of many of their free trainings and free literature. They combine things that we see that go together. Divorce leads to homelessness many places, because once the woman is thrown out, they usually have no place to go. And in our case in Nigeria, children are either split into many homes, or they're living with their parents, grandparents, and divided just so they can financially meet their needs. Incarcerated family members and homelessness go together. Physical neglect and emotional neglect tends to go along with bullying, domestic violence, and maternal depression. A mother who is depressed cannot give emotionally to a child because they can't give what they don't have themselves at that point. Mental illness, drug and alcohol use, as well as emotional and sexual abuse tend to go together in the family. Upon the things that are affecting them that you visibly can see, there are things that is happening literally below the radar. Community violence. Every day child in Nigeria is scared to death, when am I going to be kidnapped? The ones in boarding house, as good as our boarding houses are, and thank God for all you providers of education who have provided options for children who could not go to public school. A lot of these places are congregate settings that they remind them of what happened in the North. They could be kidnapped and taken. So they live under that subliminal fear. Also, there are some poor schools. Then lack of job, community disruptions, every day is mugging and every day is shooting. These kids have to go, so those who are day students have to go back and forth through all that chaos. These are things that are distressing our children. Let's layer that now with natural disasters. We have always had in Lagos flooding. Now we're having stronger winds. We're having fires. We're having heat and drought. Then we also have to remember COVID. It's not gone. As I was saying to Mrs. Koike yesterday, it's no more a pandemic. It's an epidemic now that has become endemic. And so we have to accept that this is what our life is going to be like. How do we live with COVID, just like we have survived with malaria? How do we look at the stresses that is having on our children and help them figure it out? For those who have lost family members or who have had family members who've been lost to COVID, they're thinking, when is it going to be my turn? Am I going to die? Is my dad going to die? Is my mom going to die? Who is going to pay my school fees? These are things that we did not have to worry about. These are things we didn't have to think about because we were not subjected to these issues. So I always ask each time I present, do you know your own ACE score? I'm going to put this link in the chat at the end so that you can go and take this test. It's part of our research. It will give you what your score is, and I'll explain along the way what if your score is 4 or more, you're probably traumatized and you have coped in your own way. But one thing that you have to remember is when you are 4 ACE or more, it's one of the drivers of your current medical health. So you have diabetes, you have hypertension, you have all these heart problems. Research is now telling us that your ACE score is part of that problem. I'm going to skip this just for the sake of time because it talks about all the things that we already talked about. Knowing about ACEs is important. That's why it's important you also know your ACE score, because we are not born bad, but we are also not responsible for what happened to us as children. As I said, many have coped appropriately, but some haven't coped well. And so we need to figure out how to resolve some of these unresolved issues. As I talk more about ACEs, some of you will be triggered. What that means is you're going to feel uncomfortable to the point that you feel a little sick. If you feel that way, please take a deep breath, count 4 with that inhaling, hold for another 4 counts, and slowly exhale through your mouth. That deep breathing helps you to regulate. It helps you to calm yourself. If it's getting too much for you, please walk away from the presentation. It won't help you to get sick. But what is good about knowing ACEs is that we can change. The brain is neuroplastic. What that means is the brain is able to adapt and change. There's hope and there's healing. Some of it will be covered also by Pastor Donna. So we're going to go through child safety through the lens of research, as Mrs. Koiki said earlier. And I'm going to share the data, the prevalence data in Nigerian schools, because we took it from private schools and we took information from public schools. And then we're going to focus on what should be the role of the parents, what should be the role of the educators, and we better believe both roles must flow into each other, must work seamlessly together if we're going to help our children heal. This data is from Dr. Roy Wade, and I took it from my colleague, Dr. Jane. And I just wanted to share what he found in Philadelphia before I share what we found in Lagos, Ibadan, Shagamu, and one data from Ogun State. You can see here on the right-hand side, this is the percentages of people that reported having emotional abuse as a child, physical abuse. This is before they were 18. And this is the data, the original ACE data that was accidentally found where they were trying to help people who were gaining weight, losing it, and gaining it even double later. In Philadelphia, this is what he found. It's about 3 times of emotional abuse. About sexual abuse was not as high in his data compared to the original one. And you can go through slowly. Physical neglect is high. Emotional neglect is about the same. Substance use in the household. Mental illness by family member. Witnessing domestic violence is higher. And so also is family members in prison. Now let's take a look at what we look like in Nigeria. And I broke it down into sets so you can see. The first 3 sets, these first 2 columns are the adults. And the children that we looked at, these are the N is the number of useful data. We got a lot more than that number, but there's some that if you don't complete all the 10, we toss it out because we cannot assume yes or no of what you're saying. But of the 826 returned by teachers, these are teachers who came to our trainings, and teachers and administrators that came to the training. Compared to the data in Philadelphia that says emotional abuse of 33.2%, look at the number of teachers reporting this happened to them before they were 18. Exceedingly high, has 51% of emotional abuse. Physical abuse in Philadelphia was 35%, here is 42 to 47%. Sexual abuse equally high, 16% in Philadelphia, 25 to 34% in adults. These teachers are suffering themselves. So when children act or do things, they get triggered. And so you can see how this Olympic ring of events will be happening in the school. because you cannot see the emotional pain that results from this. What's also equally scary is this data of students that's equally high. These are children who are under 18 in private schools and some in public school. And when I split the data, private school from public school, it's frightening to see what happened in public schools. The last column is more recent. This is the one we collected of all the teachers that came. We had a private-public partnership with Lagos State Ministry of Education, and during 2020, trained over 4,000 of their teachers. And from that date number, this is the number of people who reported abuse or neglect. We did not try to compare as a primary school teacher or a public school teacher better equipped or exposed as children, because that wasn't our intent. Our intent was just to find out, what does adverse childhood experiences look like in Nigeria? And you can see the first column of abuse is high. Now move to the neglect. We have the same pattern. In terms of neglect, you have physical neglect in the teachers was less than what is in Philadelphia, 19%. Emotional neglect was higher, which is 7.7%. Oops, I'm sorry. And in the students, they reported higher neglect. And each of the questions were well explained. What does emotional abuse look like? When you're belittled, you're yelled at, cursed at, or told you're not going to amount to something. What does physical neglect have? Not food, the basic needs I showed earlier in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the pattern that we now look at in terms of the household, the first column, which is the original ACEs done in 1998, and what we have of teachers and students tell not the same story. And I'll just let you pause and take a look so I'll walk you through this for sake of time. When it comes to substance use, we have seen a low level of reporting. And after we collected the data, I posed to the people, did you put alcohol as a substance use? Many said, oh, we didn't count that because it's part of normal life in Nigeria. You could drink 4 liters of alcohol and hey, that's okay. He just drinks. We don't see that as a problem. We don't see the impact it has on the house, not only on the emotional, but also the financial consequences that distresses the house unit. Now, this is where I need us to pay a little attention, because we did the ACE scores of each of the groupings. And if you look at the original ACE score here, 36% said absolutely nothing adversarial happened to them, but which is a high number compared to low numbers across our board here. Oops. Except for the children, the children is close to what the original one is. But the teachers, many of them, if you look here, it means like 77%, if you add everyone that has at least one childhood adversity, you have 77% for the first column of teachers, 81% for the second column of teachers, and 67% for the last column of students. If you have more than 4 ACEs, which more than 20% of teachers and students reported, these children are deemed traumatized. Same thing with their teachers. When we split that data to try and sort out the private school children from the public school children, we realized that 10 to 15% of children in private schools are traumatized. But in the public schools, 59% of the students are traumatized. So no wonder they act out, no wonder they do things that are bizarre, no wonder they have multiple sex partners, no wonder they smoke marijuana. And many of them smoke these drugs to just have one moment of sanity, because the record playing in their head is like a broken, you know those LP records we play, those black things? It's just playing the event over and over in their mind. Some of them, you can walk towards them and put your hand in front of them, and they're lost in their thoughts because they have dissociated. They're not present. Their body is here, but their brain isn't. And so many of these children who are reporting these high levels, 2, 3, in terms of percentage, it's really frightening when you look at this data compared to what it is in the US, even amongst the youth here. So now we're really at a place where these injuries, as they happen to children, begin to change their biology. Their brain becomes rewired. And this is what happens. Both the chemical, cellular, and even the size of their brain changes. Children that are traumatized have smaller brains in size, in terms of connectivity. And this hardwiring, which is their own adaptive behaviors, is what leads to these chronic illnesses, psychiatric disorders, impaired cognition. Many of them are labeled learning disabled, but no, they're not mentally retarded. They don't have developmental disabilities. It's the trauma that is preventing them to be able to cognitively focus. So school attendance, school performance, school behavior is also compromised. Obesity, drug use, risky sex behaviors, crime, and other things then happen. What is also sad is that as they get hardened and rewired, there is intergenerational transmission to the next offspring. So the teachers that are traumatized, their DNA, their messenger RNA changes. So the original DNA remains the same, but how it is expressed is changed. So now not only do you have this generation injured, before you're even born, your coding has changed a little bit. So we have to really sit as a people to remember that early childhood matters. Every sound, every touch, every smell, every sight that our children have actually affects their brain. The development of the brain is dependent on those sensory things. And so each time that these sensory inputs are negative, you're having a totally different child. So that's why old rules, how Yoruba people call Kishomoju, well, he can't connect that way, non-verbal communication, because his brain is not registering that. His brain is registering differently. And so you have to figure out now, how do we help this child heal so they can learn? And this is all dependent on how we build trust, healthy attachment when they're young, and continued positive reinforcement as they grow up, because they need that for peer relationship. Unfortunately, the technologies that help us learn new things has also separated them from getting that one-to-one relationship with peers to learn and develop during that phase of development. So this is just a kind of brief summary of what stress and what stress does to us. When we have predictable stress, I'm taking a test, we're all hyped and we're a little tense, we're worried, you feel a little knot in your stomach, but it's time limited, it's graded, and then a moderate in amount. What do we gain from it? We become resilient. But when we have these unpredictable stresses, you don't know when your mother and your father are going to start throwing things at each other, they're yelling, we yell at our maid, we yell at the driver. Those are the people that they know as their friend and the people they see all the time. So as you hurt them, they are hurting themselves. And these severe stresses makes them vulnerable. I've explained how the physiology and how it passes through. And their responses is this common thing we know as fight, flight, or freeze response. That many who are already chronically traumatized have heightened arousal and increased flow of adrenaline. With this perception that you can see them, it's as if they're scanning around looking for something to happen, a foot to drop. constantly anxious, and they replace realistic need with perceived threats. So over time, this low-grade anxiety is why it's easy for them to get a lot of illnesses that we can see or not see. So a child injured as early, and I'm just going to walk you through the same thing that you saw in the picture of the brain. The injury occurs as an infant. They're unable to have affect regulation. They're unable to attach. Their growth is impacted, both physical and mental growth, and you have developmental delay. Over time, untreated, they become anxious. Some would have anxiety disorders, some including PTSD. Some would, because of that inability to regulate their affect, would start having mood disorders. Disruptive behaviors that you see, yelling for no reason, smacking people for no reason, and the ones that sit quietly doesn't mean they're okay, is that they're ruminating on what is going on, and many times are actually having childhood depression. You see their grades will begin to start sliding and even fail, and poor relationships begin. As they go into their adolescence, you see what looks like conduct disorders. Some will have alcohol abuse, drug use, taking risk behaviors, including escaping school. They just don't want to hear because they know they're unable to focus, they're unable to pay attention. And so they're constantly in this war within themselves, and they're also easily victimized. Over time, now impairment has occurred. Personality disorders begin, relationship problems, they're unable to be employed. Even when they're employed, they're unable to keep the employment, and all the physical health issues follow. So enough of my bad story. I just want you to see what the brain would look like typical development and a child who is developmentally traumatized. Most of the wakeful time, it's the cognition is active, social and emotional regulation is working. They're not in survival mode. But the child who is developmentally traumatized, they're constantly in what I described earlier in a survival mode. They constantly have to regulate, and social and emotional regulation is little, cognition is also diminished. So you see why it is important that we do no harm, and that when we see harm, we must help and these children heal. Otherwise, we just have bodies in our schools trying to learn, and if they can't learn, these are the health behaviors you're going to see. Using injectable drugs, alcohol use, risky sex behaviors, binge drinking, joining groups and gangs. And unfortunately, our children are because these children are so vulnerable, they're easily pulled into cults because they want to belong. They want us to attach to something, cults, gangs. Even within the schools, you have little gangs already setting. The mean girls, the boys that don't want to talk to the other group. And if you mess me with my group, I mess with your group, that kind of relationship begins. They're 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. It's so sad now that we're seeing 5-year-olds having suicide ideation, some even moving the level up to having a plan of how they will kill themselves. 5 times more depression, and 4.2 times more of having diagnosed as dementia as they grow older. The health risk behaviors I have described, these are the physical health risk behaviors, and this is risk is higher as people have 4 or more ACEs. So when a child is wounded, what you get over time is unresolved, meaning they don't get help. You end up with an adaptive child. That is, the body is bigger, but you have that emotional injured child within. And so the action, the behaviors from that point of reference, and they just become a functional adult as they grow older. So this is what we see, and this is suggestions about how do you treat them? What do you do with them? First thing we must remember is once a child or an adult is activated, that is, if you look at them, they're pacing, they're yelling, they're not seeming to answer, you're talking over you, that's not the time to talk to them because they're like a chicken whose head is cut off. They're unable to access the higher part of their brain at that point. This lower part of the brain is already activated. What you need is things that will help them calm. Exercise, walking. If you have a challenging child in your school, basketball, walking around the schoolyard helps them to self-regulate. And little things like that, yoga for children, little things that will help them, mindfulness will help them calm, and now they can access reason, and you can use advanced cognitive behavioral therapy or all other things. So it's always it's from bottom up when you have raw emotions. And then when the person is available to you, then you can use advanced treatment. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Adejoke Udulewe to talk about child. I don't know if we're going to take a break, but we can continue talking if that's okay.
Yes, Dr. Ogukwa, I sent you a message. So there's a slight deviation. Apparently, the Honorable Commissioner for Education, Lagos State, was already present at the time we didn't realize she was here. So apologies, Ma. Honorable Commissioner for Education, Lagos State, Mrs. Folashade Adefisayo. She's here now. As we all know, her main focus as Commissioner for Education is to provide equitable education for all children in the state, irrespective of socioeconomic status, gender, or ability. It therefore will come as no surprise to us today that she has agreed to join us at this webinar to discuss the welfare of our students and the stability of our schools. Honorable Commissioner Mayor, you're welcome. If you do not mind, please take the floor and give a short keynote address. Thank you so much for being here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me well. Please pardon me. I actually was here when Mrs. Koiki was rounding up our discussion and called in Dr. Ogukwa. But thank you for allowing me to talk for just a few minutes, and that's just what I intend to do. So first, I must thank Mrs. Koiki and other members of the people who organized this program, because we all know the impact on us. It's been tremendous in the past 6 months for many of you, but for me, for 3 years. Because all along we've been facing this, and you can see that we've been working with Dr. Ogukwa and training our teachers. I worked with her even before I got into government, and I know how effective she has been in supporting and helping children who live with trauma. Because I'm one of those people who think, look, let's go for solutions. We can talk ad nauseum for ages about the problems and the symptoms, and we see them all around us. And so it's been very important to me that we look into solutions. And she's worked with us, trained, like she said, about 4,000 of our teachers. So we have a lot more problems than private schools, just that it doesn't get onto social media. And let me say that because of some of the learning that we've got from her, and because of the fact that one of our major members for child trauma is our department that handles trauma, children with trauma. It's in Ministry of Legal Justice. They work with us a lot too. And so as soon as anything happens in public schools, we move together as a team. So working with the police, working with the schools, working with the districts, working with the Ministry of Justice through the department that handles trauma, and working with the Ministry of Youth and Social Development, where we have social officers. We've actually been able to manage a number of really difficult cases. And she just showed you the data where 59% of children in government schools actually have actually live with trauma, and more trauma. I mean, just one, any level of trauma, and 70-something%. But even the lowest possible level is I can't remember the statistics. I saw 59%. Now that's extremely sad. And of course, that's because they also live apart from children in private schools, they also live with poverty. Mind-numbing daily poverty. That means that they don't have enough to eat, they don't have enough to drink, their living circumstances are terrible. Many are working children and so on. So we have that added complication. But the way I'm looking at it is, and I thank APEN, and I hope we are still going to keep working together on this because it's something that affects all of us. You remember what she said about your teachers. Majority of our teachers come from this demographic that I'm talking about, that she talked about in the public schools. Majority of teachers come from there. So they too are going to carry that trauma into your schools. And so it behoves all of us to work together. You know, the thing about the top private schools, of course, is that the children are affluent. They're able to use more social media. And so their issues tend to get into the social media and get viral very quickly because the community itself is in a very tender state, let me put it that way. Not tender positive, tender negative, in that people are very volatile and angry now. There's a high degree of poverty that we have to really manage. And so I think this is something that is very important for all of us. And when she's done, we are also going to work with our public schools. Just keep on reinforcing the message. I find that when you train once and you let them go, daily life comes in, people are not able to, people just forget these lessons and just move on business as usual. But we can see from the reaction of the public that all of us cannot run schools anymore on business as usual. First of all, parents in this day and age are not accepting usually. You know, in our day, if you were abused and you told your parents, oh, your parents wouldn't believe you for sure. Nowadays, they've swung to the other extreme. They believe the child exclusively and don't even want to hear any excuses at all. So it's clear that we have to look for a way of managing both extreme issues, both extreme reactions when these things happen. So I'm very happy that we are doing this because we have to look at our role as school owners. When we say in loco parentis, we look at it as, we say it a lot. Education is, so we are in loco parentis. In loco parentis is a very, very serious responsibility. I remember running a boarding house. I didn't used to sleep at night because I was so fearful through the night. What will happen? And so I was very jittery. The slightest sound in the middle of the school and I would wake up and run outside. What is happening? And that is the level of care, that is the level of responsibility because parents have entrusted their children to us. They don't want to hear any stories. And once you are in loco parentis, whatever happens in your school is essentially your own, you are not playing your role of care, role of duty well enough as far as they are concerned. And so we all have to look inwards to say, what is our role as school owners, as people who run schools? How do we improve the quality of the boarding house experience? Because I have also talked to many young people. I've read a lot of write-ups about them. And sometimes I'm in despair. Should we even run boarding schools? But we need to, because like Dr. Ogunkwa told me today when I expressed this view, she said, better they're in boarding school than they're at home, where they're subject to so many events that we can see, neglect, abuse, and so on. But they also face that in school under our watch. So how do we manage this? I think I'm here to learn how we are going to manage it. And my pessimism about boarding schools and our ability to manage them well in this day and age, I think, I hope will be cured because, like I said, I'm someone who just wants solution, not just to talk about the problems. So again, our role as school owners, the role of parents. What's the role of parents? Parents cannot dump their responsibilities onto the school. And that's where schools have to decide, how are we going to relate with parents, especially both day and boarding schools, because they can't say the child was, you know, sometimes when a child misbehaves and you tell the parents, they say, well, she wasn't doing this in my house. It must have been what you taught them in school. Whereas we've seen from this study that there are a lot of bad things that are happening from home. So we've got to look at parenting as well. Parenting is a major problem nowadays. And like I always say, and I know I keep repeating it like, I repeat it every time I talk about parenting. Parenting is just not natural. Parenting is biology. Having a child is biology. Any animal can have children. We know dogs have children, pigs have children. Everybody can have children. But bringing up children is a totally different thing. It's only human beings who have to bring up children over an extended period. Even the few animals that look after their offspring do it for a brief period, and then the child is on his own and goes out into the wilds and tries to make his or her own way. But human beings will look after our children and we retain our relationship with them from birth to death. It's not a relationship that ever ends. And I like to use the example of myself. With my grandmother, my mother was 75 or 76. She had a problem. Her mother was still alive in her 90s, and my mother started crying. And I remember going to my grandmother's room and seeing my 70-something-year-old mother, herself a grandmother many times over, kneeling down beside her mother with her head on her mother's chest. A 90-something-year-old woman holding her daughter, cuddling her and comforting her. So that relationship is from life to death, from giving life to death. And so we've got to work on that relationship in Nigeria as well. Please don't let us think it's not our duty as schools. It affects us too much when there's poor quality parenting. And then the role of government. Yeah, we've given out this document. I hope you all have it. And like Dr. Ogunkwa said, that it's not just something you put on the shelf and forget about, but something that you actually reinforce and live and work with on a daily basis. So as government, we've written that book. Our own now is regulation and ensuring that the legal provisions are kept to. We will keep on working at that. It's not something that I think we've done well enough so far. And so right now we are concentrating a lot of effort on ensuring that we look at that document again. Then we look at our own regulation. How are we implementing? How are we ensuring that schools are able to meet the standards that are there? And then when problems happen, what is the best approach to schools? Like all of you have said, I had a group of people coming to me. Closure of the school is not usually the best thing. And I did tell them that we will look into it. The main thing about closure is that when we are fearful that there is evidence that there's a lot of neglect of children in this particular school, we tend to go for closure. But we will now readdress it so that we are less proactive, but less reactive, and become more proactive in the management of our schools. And we do want to work with you. We don't want it to be private schools on one side. You might say you have less. You may have less, but because, of these adverse childhood experiences, but because the children are so affluent, the issues with private schools come out in the open and they annoy the community. They lead to great uproar and so on, because of course, the only educated and well-off parents can be on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram all the time. So we really, really are both facing very dangerous and very serious situations that I think we should address together and not say where public schools are like that or like this. The children all want to be the same. And again, I will use an example. When I was doing my master's, there was a study I did about English across the curriculum and our loss of our Nigerian languages. And one thing we noticed was that the children, I interviewed children from affluent schools and children from public schools and children on the streets who are not even going to school. The major role models of these children are these influencers, these social media people and musicians and so on, who tend to use broken as their language of communication. So for the children, even in very rich homes, they told me that they love broken English. I said, why? They said it's the language of the youth, it's language of the streets. You won't believe that these affluent children were envious of the poor children who had access to shisha or whatever it is easily and had multiple sexual partners. So the influences that the children are getting in even your schools are not just from home and so on, but from the streets. They think the streets are cool. They told me that broken is cool. Parents are not cool, so we speak English to them. But when we are among ourselves, no matter where we are, we speak broken because it's our language. So I think we've got to be very careful and start working together. So government, our role is regulation. We must protect children. We must safeguard children. And I'm hoping that we'll work together. We've started talking with APEN and not APEN, COPSIL, or the organization of all public schools, of all private schools. And what they want to do is to run a lot of courses, and we are willing to work with them. I think we would be pleased if we could have a joint planning team together. I know you are planning yours. I know we are planning ours. I know that your children and parents are different, but I know that there are many areas of common issues that we need to address with all parents. And mind you, not all private schools have very affluent parents, as we say. So I'm willing to learn a lot. I'm here to learn, here to listen, and here to let you know that the role of government is to work with you. It's not to be against you. It's not a we versus them issue. It's us, because it's affecting all of us. Whenever things happen in the private schools, you should know that we in government suffer tremendously as well, because we are blamed for everything. Everything, literally, they say it is government. A child misbehaves, it is government. A school misbehaves, it is government. And so we have accepted that it is us, and therefore we too need to look inwards. But I hope that schools are willing and ready to work with us openly so that we do something about this terrible thing that is affecting the next generation. I leave you by reminding you that many of your teachers are from this demographic, from these schools. When they finish in public schools, most of your students are not going to read education, they are not going to teach. You know the demographic that will teach, that will go into the teaching profession, and therefore teach your children, people who themselves have been exposed to such adverse circumstances, that is better that we all accept that we are in this thing together and we work together. Once again, I thank you, Mrs. Koiki. I thank you, Dr. Ogunkwa and her team. I thank everybody here, and I look forward to what we are going to co-create or jointly work on together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Commissioner. Thanks for letting us know where you stand, for helping us understand that the role of government in this is with the regulation and implementation. And it's even better reassuring to know that your focus is on joint planning, as we all have this as a common issue. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing. And I know that you're also going to learn from the experts that are in the house. So we'll continue with the panel discussion, the presentations. We'll have Mrs. Adejoke Ogunlewe. Please take the floor and share with us the legal implications. Thank you. Mrs. Adejoke Ogunlewe, please.
I'm not sure. Are you able to see your slide?
You needed to
go ahead.
unmute me, ma. You needed to unmute me. I couldn't do that myself.
All right.
Okay.
Glad we
everyone.
have you
Good
on.
evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Honorable Commissioner, Dr. Ogunkwa, the convener, and the chairperson of APEN, and everyone that is listening. Thank you very much, Dr. Ogunkwa, for this opportunity. I'd quickly like to start by, and I know I'm on a very short time, so I'd quickly like to start by saying that the end goal of this session on safeguarding children and then the intersection with the law and all the provisions of the law is to bring further awareness to the provisions of the law and also sensitize school owners on how they can take proactive approach, as the Honorable Commissioner has just informed us, as to safeguarding their students, their wards, in their position as local parentis, and also safeguarding their businesses using best practices, international best standards, and preventive measures and risk analysis. At the end of the day, I acknowledge the fact that while the APEN and other organizations that are educators are raising the next generation of people that will be in the workforce. The educators raised me. It's also a business, and I acknowledge that whatever recommendations that we will be profiling as a team, and in particular on this session, must be very respectful, cost-effective, and reasonable and easy to implement. So my goal is to simplify this concept and bring it home and reinforce what we already know, and maybe bring awareness to what we may not be aware of. So the next step is to define the concept in very simple terms. So rape, as simple as in the most basic term, is the sexual offense of having non-consensual sexual intercourse through the use of force, threat, or fraud, maybe coercion, forcing someone, blackmailing a child. Because I'm going to go from the general to the particular. I won't talk about rape in broad terms, but as it affects children. And then consent is when a person voluntarily and willfully agrees to undertaking an action that another person suggests. Now, we must understand that some parts of the law says things like statutory rape. There is no agreed definition, but in many jurisdictions, statutory rape applies to when there is a child-on-child crime, like we've seen in our experience as educators. Sometimes the perpetrator is a child on another child, molesting, abusing, or being physically abusive or sexually abusing another child. So in that instance, we'll call it statutory rape. Or when the other person is unable to give influence, like a person that is mentally challenged. The criminal law 2004 used to call it person that was deranged or an imbecile. But I think the law has realized that languaging is important, and those things have changed. And children cannot give consent. A child that is less than 18 years old, according to the Convention of the Child's Rights, African Charter, the Child's Rights Act of 2003, and many other laws where children are mentioned, cannot give consent. However, in places like the North, if you have people who are represented from maybe the Northern Nigeria here, the age of consent under the penal code is 14 years. Now we'll go to duty of care, because I'm going to talk about duty of care a lot. It's going to be a recurring conversation in the next 7 minutes. It's a legal obligation that we all have to take reasonable steps to not cause foreseeable harm to another person or property. So it's a concept, it's a principle under the law of tort, and it's a very broad spectrum principle. And the test is, what would a reasonable man do? So there are many things under civil law that can come under duty of care, and I'll quickly explain how this may affect us, or this may come to us as private educators and owners of schools, and as teachers and educators too. And then the duty of the care of the teacher is that teachers must take reasonable care to ensure that their students do not meet foreseeable injury, and that they have a duty to protect children against foreseeable risk of personal injury or harm. The standard of care is that of a reasonably careful parent, and that ties into the concept of locus parentis. When a child is in your custody, as a person or as an organization, you are the parent in that instance. And sometimes you're not just protecting a child, a student, a young person against external aggression. You are protecting that child against themselves and against other people who are fellow children. And I see that that makes it really tricky and difficult too. Next slide, please.
Yeah, wait.
So I briefly mentioned some of these laws and statutes that particularly speak and affect children, that makes provision for children. I ran through some of them before, and I must say and reiterate again, I know it's already been mentioned, the JSVRT is a forerunning organization operating from Lagos State. And they have a policy, which is an executive order that was signed on the 16th of December 2016 by the former governor in Lagos State. And it has very instructive forms, templates, and laws. I mean, clear warnings that we may not just want to put away, but look at, adopt, make it like a very important manual. It's one of the very important laws, especially for people who work and operate and have their establishments, schools in Lagos State. So I mentioned the penal code. The criminal code is applicable in southern Nigeria. There is also the Lagos State Sex Offenders Monitoring Program and mandated reporting, where they have a register where sex offenders are reported, and there's a mandated reporting system where when you see something, you have to say something. and the person who is reporting is protected. Then there's also the Prevention Against Domestic Violence Law 2007. It's peculiar to Lagos. There's also the Violence Against Person Prohibition Bill, which is applicable in places like Abuja. And the definition of any person also applies to children. There's also the Cyber Crimes Prohibition Act 2015, where issues of recording and filming somebody having a sexual act, filming somebody in a precarious act without the person's consent, or filming someone and blackmailing a child or a young person. I've had course in the line of my work to trigger the law, to activate the law when this is happening, because it's a crime to release somebody's pictures when they're in situations where they didn't give consent. And there's also the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which is the ground norm that guarantees inherent rights like right to life, dignity, and the right to privacy. So the Child's Rights Act is not generally adopted in Nigeria. Some states have domesticated it and some states are not. And I'll just run briefly through particular sections that affects and speaks to children. Section 31, for example, says unlawful sexual intercourse with a child. No person shall have unlawful sexual intercourse with a child. And when a person is charged under this section, it is immaterial that the offender believed the person to be above the age of 18. So not knowing the person's age, not knowing the child's age, or assuming the child's age is not a defense for a perpetrator. It's not a defense for anybody who is having sexual exploitation or sexual abuse, as guaranteed in Section 42. Then also the criminal law of Lagos State too covers defilement, unlawful sexual intercourse with a child too. And then also the indecent treatment of boys under 14 is an offense of felony and is liable to imprisonment for 7 years. So there are laws that actually protect these children, that ensures that they are safeguarded when they are properly applied and implemented, and when they are made to be aware of, where the people who are handling those children understand the pros and cons and the consequences, the cause and effect of their actions and inactions. Please, next slide, ma'am. So I'll walk quickly to the duty of care of schools without overflogging what laws are. I know that we are aware of those things, and this is readily available. All those documents is readily available. So the duty of care that the child is protected is deeply rooted in the Constitution, like I mentioned earlier, like right to life, dignity, and all that. And also, when an incident occurs, I would like to be very practical in this instance. The duty of care to disclose to the law. So as an educator, as an organization, a school that is registered under the law as a business, it may not be easy to arrest a business or charge a business to court, but there's a principle in corporate law called lifting the veil. So the veil will be lifted and say, who are the directors? Who are the people in charge of this school? And more importantly, who are the people that were in custody of these children, that had authority over them and was acting in locus parentis? So as co-owners and educators, it is imperative that we take cognizance of the fact that we are not only protecting the children in our care as local parents, as I mentioned earlier, from external aggression or violence, we are also saddled with protecting them against themselves. And the law recognizes and makes provisions for when children themselves are perpetrators. So the duty of care that the school has and the educators have, and the guidance counselor people, the boarding house people, people in position of authority have, is the duty of care to disclose to the law enforcement when they see the slightest, even if a child is being abused from home, you see it, you have a duty to report immediately. If it's within the school premises, there's a duty of care to inform the parent or the guardian of the survivor timelessly. Timelessly is something that will be subject to definition under law. Like, was it done immediately? Was it done haphazardly? How was it done? What is the definition of timelessly? It has to be immediate for safety purposes. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? The educator and the school has a duty to investigate. Obstruction of justice is a crime. Contamination of evidence and failure in the duty of care tests are situations that can make the school as an institution culpable based on the circumstances and the peculiarities of the case. The offender is primarily culpable, but the school also has a fair share of culpability when this happens. So, and I have an example. if the school would be responsible if a child, for example, gets kidnapped, or for example, goes missing during school hours and they are not able to find that child. Therefore, the school is also responsible when another child has sexual intercourse with another child. The school is also equally responsible, and the people, not just the school, the people who are in charge of those children at that particular point in time have a duty of care too. So the focus on legal implications on the school and the teachers is to bring to awareness the fiduciary duty that can be faced when there is maybe negligence, an omission, an error that leads to either physical or sexual violence against the children. So when there is no direct culpability, like I said earlier, the principle of lifting the veil would apply. And the goal of, next slide please, the goal of this session, like I said earlier, is to bring to awareness and to, in conclusion, share some risk management recommendations that will not only be safeguarding the children and the students in the custody of the school, but also protecting the brand integrity, the brand identity, the good work that the school is doing from things like backlashes, bad press, and most importantly, litigation, to ensure that the floodgates of litigation is not open against private educators or even public educators. So the Honorable Commissioner said something and drew an inference between our public schools and private schools, and that the reason why there's a lot of attention, there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions when things happen is because of the bit of affluence that our parents of children in private school has. So the goal is to ensure that there's enough proactive measures, there are enough forms, templates, there is an adequate legal structure that the schools can create to ensure a comprehensive safety structure that specifically deals with sex and physical violence. And this must factor in the teachers and other personnel as first responders. So it's not only the duty of the guidance counselor or somebody who teaches sex education or maybe science to do this, or the boarding house mistress, or some people that occupy that position. Every teacher, every person that has capacity of authority over the children is a first responder and has a duty of care to respond. There's a particular clause in the DSVRT document that says, as a caregiver, your duty is to safeguard and protect the rights of the children committed to your trust. If you see something, say something. You are a mandated reporter. It is extremely instructive. Can we have the last slide?
Well, you have just 1 minute.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So thank you. So having a legal structure in place that protects all parties involved, including and especially the school as an establishment, things like consent letters, a structure, a mandated reporting structure and release form, a safety policy that ensures background check or that the employees of the school at all levels are properly vetted and onboarded. Thank you very much for listening. I will now hand over the webinar back to Dr. Obunkwa.
Thank you so much. I didn't want to keep Dr. Jean and Dr. Donna out of the piece. Obviously, from my discussion earlier with Mrs. Koiki, this is not a 90-minute issue, but we'll do the best we can to just run through the rest. As Mrs. Ogunlewe just talked at length about preventing harm. And now we'll just talk a little bit about role of adults. It's all of us. Just like the commissioner said, it's not the school or home, it's all of us. And yes, the school is responsible for, the home is responsible for physical, emotional, social safety of their children. When they come to school, you've taken on that parental role. And so all the above applies, but more meaningfully, you must show evidence of training and retraining of your staffs. It's good to have consent letters, and it must be informed consent, because sometimes we just give a piece of paper and at the door, sign here. If that person did not read it well and then sign, yes, their signature is there, they're going to tell you, forced me to sign here. So it has to be informed consent. Also, we must make sure that all our schools are becoming trauma informed. It's going to take time, but we have to start. Preventing harm at home, as I said, you're not going to be able to see a lot of things that happen to the children at home. But the important part of that is that we have to be able to identify when we see symptoms of children that are either going through abuse, neglect, or enduring trauma in their homes. I usually refer to them, some homes, as a war zone, because the children, if you ask them, will tell you why they're sad. It's as simple as that. Safeguarding actions we can take, all this needs to be done. And bullying, especially cyberbullying, children with disability, some children that have talked about their gender identity, and also paying attention to those who can be radicalized, put in a cult, join a gang. And there's also the sexual exploitation. We tend to feel like that is not in our shop. A child that is beginning to have clips or videos of herself naked, there must be somebody pushing her to develop it. There must be a market somewhere for it. So you have to investigate, where is this coming from? Because that child could be sexually exploited by their driver and you won't know. But because of the visibility and the negative attention that they're getting, they think it's fun or something to do. And one thing I want to remember is sharing children's nude pictures, whether we're trying to make a point or something, it's pornography. It's against the law. So when people start forwarding these emails, I live on my platforms, do not put on this platform. It's not right, and it's actually unlawful. So I'm going to skip things. If we have time, I'll come back to things that you can do to help. I also want us to remember, go and look at that document. I'm going to put this link. For those who don't have it, please print it, read it. The warnings are clear. The state's rules are clear. The forms are there. Even the consequences of not having something as mandatory as a designated officer whose job description is keeping children safe. If you don't have one, you already violated a major rule. So take a look at your structure, take a look at how you organize. A social worker, that's what SW is, or it's someone trained in child protection, has to have that role. The responsibilities and expectation of that role is in that document. Failure to have a designated officer and I'm quoting what I found in that document, it shall be regarded as gross misconduct with disciplinary action. So even not having it, you already crossed the line, you shouldn't. So we're going to skip all this, and I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Reverend Donna Jones. As I said, this is how most of the work on restorative justice and restorative cities is what we work, Dr. Gina and I are part of, and we are really happy that she constantly looks into what happened to the child, what happened to the family, what happened to the community, not what's wrong with the community. And understanding past traumas, how this triggers their parent experiences, committed to supporting people as they heal. And also we need to leave children feeling edified, empowered in our discipline. If we're constantly picking at them and throwing stuff at them, we're actually breaking them as opposed to building them up. So now I'm handing over to Dr. Reverend Lawrence Jones.
Thank you, Dr. B. And is it possible for me to actually share?
Yes, share the screen and you can control it from your end.
Okay, thank you. So I'm so glad to be with you, my brothers and sisters, and also want to give Thanksgiving for the great work of APEN and the organizers, to Dr. Bukola, Ogonkwa, who has been in my life for decades now, unbelievably, and had a chance to travel with her to Lagos and other places in Nigeria where we were working together. So I am grateful to have been to your country. Also, restorative practices and restorative justice. In the States, I always say that it is not a concept that began in the West. It actually began in Black and brown countries like Africa, Asia, India, and many other places. And there is restorative practice and restorative justice history in Nigeria, as well as Congo, South Africa. So it is something we know as a people, and it continues to influence our strength. And I'm going to share this. to start there. I know we won't be together very long because it's the framework, it's the lens of restorative work and restorative practices. It is identifying and paying attention to the strength. It's paying attention to the resilience, really noticing the resilience and strength in our children and in our families and in our communities. So we're grateful in so many ways for the miracles that we are seeing all the time. You know, children who've experienced the worst that life has to offer, that have experienced rape and incest and experienced extraordinary poverty. And what we notice, which is amazing, is that there is that something inside. And when we do restorative work, what we're doing is we're restoring that strength that is already there in communities and in families. And restorative justice says that it is there, that there is nothing that really, as long as we have breath, that strength is inside. And that is the strength that gives us the resilience that, regardless of our ACEs scores and everything else, allows us to continue to love and grow and develop. The principles of restorative practices, and Dr. B, you can actually put the original slides back up. We were just having trouble with the video. But the principles of restorative practice are also the hallmark for restorative justice. On most of our continents, especially within the African community, as well as Nigerian community, as well as the US, including the American Indian population and in our cities and towns, what we're seeing is that, see, you're going way too far, Dr. B. Can we go back? Yes, go back to really the very beginning, because I might not get to all of this. What we see is that as people are working together as communities, and the Restorative Cities Initiative that Dr. Kola Ogonkwa talked about earlier is relating to communities working together. One of the places where that work has been so difficult is in the area of education, because sometimes as educators, we can forget that our children are part of communities and part of families and part of social systems that are all around them. And what restorative practices in schools try to help us all to do is to include all of those systems as we're considering the best interests of our children and their families. Restorative practices in schools, you'll see this term, from harm to wholeness. And that's really related to a lens. Many times in this work, we have a lens where we're only seeing harm. So when we see restorative, you notice I'm saying restorative practices and not restorative justice. Restorative justice is what happens when harm happens, but restorative practices are in place throughout the system, throughout the school. When a child is doing very well and getting ready to go off to university, those are the times for restorative circles. We don't want to save these great strategies and tactics for when a child or an adult has in some way broken a rule or has gotten lost or is truant. We want to start to, we are advocating for whole restorative schools and communities. In schools, restorative practices change how teachers teach and how students learn. It moves from enforcing a compliance-driven disciplinary style to one that cultivates caring, empathy, and community in schools. I don't know a whole lot about the Nigerian school or the Lagos school systems, or the systems of those of you who are on this call, but I do know often, at least in the United States, school systems can work in isolation of the communities that the children are from. And yet those communities are having amazing positive and challenging sometimes impact on our children's lives. The intent of restorative practices in school and restorative education is to transform schools into safe learning environments where everybody feels safe physically and emotionally. And we do use the lens of trauma and resilience just to understand some of the behaviors that we're seeing. This restorative practices, this is actually a social science area, and they are best practices. My congregation, I've also am a pastor, and my congregation started a restorative high school in early 2000, and Dr. Ugunkwa was there as a trauma resilient contractor with us, and did a wonderful job of assisting us to have to live into a restorative environment at that location. The children we worked with were all older teens who had been harmed. They were older teens who had caused harm. And these are teens who had been kicked out of the regular high schools. There were schools that said they cannot come back. And what we found in Temple University, where Dr. Jean now teaches, also did a study on what we did, a statistical analysis. And so what we found was these children who had been kicked out because of behavioral situations, they had with us in 3 and 4 years, we had an 85% graduation rate. And our community at the time had a graduation rate of less than 50%. And that was the kids that weren't being kicked out. We're only graduating less than 50%. So we were working with children who had extraordinary stress. Some of the children were in conjugate care. They were living in group homes. Some of the children had been incarcerated. And these were teens. And what we found is these weren't teens who caused trouble. These were teens who had something inside that was so strong that with love and care and on the adult side especially, a disciplined approach to recognizing who they were, and then working not only with them, but working with them and the community members. We had one young person who was really having a hard time just getting to school in general. And our staff was working with the person, and everybody was really, the parents, everybody was trying to help this young man, the social worker, everybody. And so we're sitting down and we're having a restorative conference, which is done in a circle. It's done with everyone having a voice, everyone having a chance to talk, everyone contributing to the resolution. And in this young man's case, he had a contribution. And we asked him who he needed to have with him. And he didn't say his parent, he didn't say any adult. He said his girlfriend. And our social workers from the city, they said, oh, no, she can't come. The young man was about 14, 15. Well, we said, no, this is a restorative environment. If that's who he needs to support him, she comes. She came, and one of the first things that she said when we talked about how he was going to come to school and do those things he needed to do to be successful, she said, oh, he's coming because I'm going to make sure he comes. That young couple started dating at 14. We met them when she was about 15 and he was about 15. They've been married now for 10 years and they both finished high school, and he finished on time. He didn't finish on time because his mama made him go. He finished on time because that 15-year-old girlfriend of his made him go. That's the power of bringing in the community. And as we look at a lens of equity, where it's applied to everything, I think our school had that success rate, not because we had somebody in a corner that saw all the kids if they had a problem, because actually we didn't. We didn't have a disciplinarian. We didn't have this principal you send the kids to. In fact, when we first started, the teachers wanted to know, how are we going to do this if we don't kick them out of school? And we said, no, we love them to life, and we get to know them, and we let them know we care. And we let them know nothing will kick them out of community. And as we all learn more and more about restorative practices and restorative justice, we find that that within the African communities and within the Black and Brown communities of every nation, what we're finding with indigenous communities is not a system of kicking out. If a person has to leave the community, there's a way back. And restorative practices and restorative processes begin with looking at strengths, begin with both the child and the adult sense of who's supporting them. They begin with a commitment of time. That is not something that happens quickly. And it begins with a total system approach. It begins with systems that are age appropriate, where both students and staff and parents are giving the information that they need about trauma, about resilience. It's not something that only the staff has, but it's something everyone has. And the students are given the opportunity to frequently, and you've already talked about that, identify their resilience and celebrate their strengths. And you all know, as I do, there could be somebody acting up every day. And we don't notice that one time or that one day when they did really well. That adds. The other and the last thing I'd like to point out is that we also affirm the same practices and the same restorative strategies that are written and available to all of us. Those strategies of circle, those strategies of building empathy, those strategies of people looking each other in the eye and having honest conversation. Those are strategies that we didn't need people to write up. They're in us. They're already in us. So it's saying, let's release what we already know as humans, and let's apply it with people, regardless of their age or their status in the school. Let's invite the community, the child, the people into determining who are your resources, who is helping you, what are your strengths. You want to go to school, you want to go to college, who are your people, who are your resources, who are the folk that are cheering you on. And if we press it so far, we haven't found too many people that'll stand and say they have no one. It's our job to figure out how to work with the someone they do have. And together in restorative justice and restorative practices in school has to be a together. It has to be the students, it has to be the caregivers, it has to be not only the community of the school where they're going, but even a community of the school that they came out of. You might go to school in one city and live in another, one community and live in another. So looking with a global sense of who is there to support and who else has those strengths necessary for the child to live a whole life. Lastly, there's just a couple of classroom principles. I think that's toward the end, Dr. B. You can go one more. And keep on keeping on.
That's the last one. I think I passed it.
So there are assumptions around restorative practices. When restorative practices, we identify needs and obligations. And needs, remember, all of this is applied to both positive and challenging situations and behaviors. Someone wants to go on and become a doctor. We want to identify the needs and also the obligations of the person, the community, and the family, and the staff. It's a whole system approach. We want to realize that harm can be made right through empathy, being able to see ourselves in someone else's situation and not judge. Through dialogue and mutual agreement, those agreements, I will do this, become the obligations. And there are agreements that teachers make, that students make, that administration makes, that families make. When harm happens, and remember, restorative practice isn't for always. It is for always, not just for when harm happens. So as we're working together restoratively, every now and then harm happens. And when that happens, then everybody most impacted has a say, including the children, in determining the resolution. And that the effectiveness isn't judged by the extent to which people take certain types of responsibility, but is judged by what needs are met is judged by the relationships that are encouraged, is judged by people following through on what they said they were going to do. And in this way, everybody, and we emphasize everybody because the children have a very important role in determining who is part of their team, who is part of their, in restorative work, we always talk, most things are done in circles because you can see one another, a circle without a table, a circle without a barrier. And all of these folk will work together if there's been harm to promote repair, if it's possible to promote a measure of reconciliation, and to promote reassurance. So we do believe sincerely that, and that's the end of the presentations. I know we're short for time, but the main thing that I'm here to do is encourage your schools and your systems to look deeply into restorative practices, to look at it holistically and not just as it relates to when harm is done, because harm is done when we're not systematically addressing right, when we're not systematically helping children and their families achieve to be excellent. Harm is done if we don't include everybody. And please include the children in determining the solutions and the opportunities, and hear their voices, hear the voices of the parents and the caregivers, and hear the voices of the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donna Jones. And now to my colleague in crime. And I say that from his area of specialty is criminal justice and forensic science, Dr. Jean Wright. Your turn.
Thank you, Dr. B, as we affectionately call you. And thank you to the Honorable Commissioner and to the Reverend Dr. Jones, and to the esteemed attorney, and to our facilitator and host. Thank you to all of you. It's a very important that we're having this conversation, and I'm honored to be a part of this community that loves children, this community that has dedicated their lives to children, this community that has dedicated their lives to the families. And so what I will basically do is I'm going to go through, and Dr. B, we'll do this together. I'll start here. This is a great place to start. And then we'll go through, and I will skip and we'll tag team. And I think you want me to get to crisis management at some point. And so I'm respectful of people's time. And so I just want to start with this statement by the World Health Organization, because it really does cement everything that you've heard so far during this webinar. And even though you can read it, I want to read it out loud. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The reason I want to start with that statement, after all you've heard about ACEs and the challenges and all that information, is most necessary because it grounds us. It's level setting for us to understand the challenges the world over, not just in Nigeria, not just in Lagos, not just on the continent of Africa or the United States or South America. We could go country by country, continent by continent, and talk about the challenges that children are experiencing the world over. But let's be clear, we're on this call because these are our children. These are our children. Across the African diaspora, these are our children. And so when we think about that statement by the World Health Organization, it really says that we need to look at all the things that go into health. If you look at the left side of this pie chart, it shows you the things that are pretty much not necessarily under our control. Healthcare, the environment we're born and raised in and grew up in. Many people do not have the option of changing the environment. And then of course, our DNA, human biology, which Dr. B already went over. To the right side of that chart, you see the things that are directly under our control. But those are the things that Dr. B talked about in terms of what some people end up experiencing. When I look at these things, especially smoking, alcohol use, drug use. Those are actually symptoms of the underlying trauma that Dr. B spoke of. And the results of not taking care of one's nutrition and using alcohol and all those things, yes, that can develop into obesity and high blood pressure. And we also look at how stress is the silent killer, which causes stroke in many areas. Next slide. And so when we think about wellness, which is what we're all seeking, not just for our children, but for ourselves, because as adults, if we're not healthy, then we are not able to pass on health to others. You can't give what you don't have. Whether you're a parent, whether you are a teacher, whether you're an educator, you're a government official, we all have to invest in our own health. It's like being on the airplane, right? When they talk to you about the mask, what do they tell you? Secure your mask before you assist others. And so wellness defined is really what we're looking at. And so if we connect those 3 slides of wellness defined, if we connect the World Health Organization definition on health and wellness, this is what I really want us to get to. Health is a myriad of things, not just getting a good report from your physician. We all want a good report from our physician, but I don't care if you can run a marathon. If you do not have the ability to pay your bills, you're not healthy. If you go to work every day hating your boss or your job, you're not healthy. If you don't have a job and you cannot feed your family, you're not healthy. If you don't have good relationships with the people in your community, your family, you're not healthy. And so health is more than just a physical manifestation. And so this is a chart that just shows you the other potential parts that make you well. And when any of these, intellectual, environmental, you name it, when those things are not on par, you're not well. Next slide. This is just give you an idea of the cycle of violence that happens. And I will not focus on this slide because you will have this slide deck, I'm sure. But I just want to let you know that when you look at jail or death, that is really what Dr. B covered earlier when she talked about ACEs. It's the same in the United States in terms of what happens. I can tell you this, when somebody is shot or stabbed or otherwise harmed in some kind of way where they're in a hospital and they do not die, I can tell you that before that person is ever released from the hospital, the streets know that they didn't die. And retaliation is a very common retort, either by the person who was harmed, their family or friends, or if they happen to be part of a gang or something like that. The streets know, and there will be retaliation. Next slide. So when you think about the impact of trauma, I look at this slide because of the date. And this slide actually, when we look at the cost, and when we get to the next slide, you'll see it even more plainly. Public health in the United States in particular is full of individuals who report trauma. The vast majority of those that report trauma are women. Now, that doesn't mean that men are not traumatized. It means they're less likely to report it, especially in some type of government form. Next slide. And so when you think about psychological trauma, it frequently triggers mental health and substance use. Why? Because just like the young people that Dr. Acuna talked about, you want to somehow change your reality just for a moment. You know that the problem doesn't go away. And these young people are smart. They don't use drugs and alcohol because they think it's going to get rid of their problems. No, they're smarter than that. They self-medicate because of the pain, because of the trauma. And so what I'm talking about, that I want you to imagine, most of us can understand when you are walking around your house and you're cleaning up or something and you bump your leg on a table. We all understand the physiology of that the blood rushes to the area and a bruise forms on your leg, right? We all understand that if you're cooking in your kitchen and you're chopping up vegetables and you accidentally slice your finger, blood rushes to the area, right? If it's not a deep cut, a scab will form and you will begin to heal, but there may be a scar. And so I want you to think of psychological trauma and emotional trauma using that example as, how do you see something that is invisible? When you bump into the table, you see the bruise on your leg. When you slice your finger, you see the blood on your hand. But what about a emotional, psychological bruise? What about a internal cut? How does that look? Well, I would suggest to you, it looks like the behaviors that you're witnessing in your schools, in your community, and in your family. That acting out, the things that we see, the behaviors that are manifest from harm, that are manifest from trauma, come out in the acting out period. And so trauma is shrouded in secrecy, denial, and is often ignored. That old, what happens in this house stays in this house. Well, that's not particularly healthy for the child, and it ends up not being healthy for the adults keeping those secrets, because eventually what happens in the dark always comes to light. Next slide. And so when we think about the impact of trauma for children, and again, I can talk about the United States. I hope to be able to join you in Nigeria. So Dr. B keeps promising we're going to get there after the COVID is over. And so I hope that actually happens. But 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions come from fatherless homes. Now, in the United States, those fatherless homes are because most of those homes that are fatherless are because the men are incarcerated or dead. Right now, we have an epidemic of violence in Philadelphia between the ages of 16 and 34. And I've just looked at a data set the other day that I need to lower that age to about 12 now. We need to lower that from 16 to 12 in terms of perpetrators of violence and victims of violence. But it's taking men out of our communities, out of homes, either to the cemetery or to incarceration. 71% of all high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. Now, let me stop here and say, I applaud those homes where mothers have raised children, kings and queens, by themselves. And it happens all the time, every day. What this data is telling us is not only are mothers just amazing, but also that there is a place for co-parenting. There is a place, even if they're not in the same home, even if they're not continue to be in the same space, you can co-parent. We prove this in the United States by the program I have called Fathers and Children Together, where we are able to give fathers who are incarcerated access to the school principals and to their children for their behavioral reports, their academic reports. And let me tell you, when we're able to connect those fathers with their children, even though these fathers are incarcerated, and principals have given us permission to connect these families, behavior problems go down, grade point averages go up, and they're not in the home. And so, yes, we need mothers to continue doing what they're doing, which is saving the world, but we also need fathers to do their fair share in their part as co-parents. You can skip through this, Dr. B. You covered that pretty nicely. In terms of the impact of violence for boys and men of color, I really want to stop just briefly and look at the social impact. Again, I'm going to have to lower that 18, that age of 18. It's getting lower every day. But what I really wanted to focus in on this slide is that as you look at that cohort, think about the adverse childhood experiences that Dr. Acuna talked about earlier, right? And think about what happens if trauma is not resolved or addressed or treated or any kind of way. Then those young people turn into teenagers who turn into young adults who may be, as the Honorable Commissioner said, may be the teachers who are also bringing their own trauma into your schools. What I can tell you is this. I was in a city on the East Coast of the United States about 3 years ago before the pandemic. And I was teaching them on the impact of trauma in communities of faith. And this Christian church had brought me in to talk to their congregation about trauma. After the program, an elderly woman came up to me. And the only reason I know she was elderly is because she told me she remembered my mom. So she knew my family. And she was in her 80s. And she told me, she said, Dr. Wright, I need to tell you something. When I was 10 years old, I was sexually abused. I've never told anybody. I've carried this around all my life. Now, I'm not a math major, but that tells me if she was in her 80s and this happened to her when she was 10, she's been carrying this secret around for 70 plus years. That's what trauma shrouded in secrecy will do. And she went on to tell me all of the challenges her life has been impacted by because she was carrying that secret and did not get help. And so this slide here, again, you'll have access to all this, just gives you the data as to the gender differences in trauma. Okay, and again, women are more likely to report than men. Doesn't mean that men are not experiencing. All right, in the justice system, you can keep going. I'm just going to tell you that in the justice system, the vast majority of the people that I deal with, okay, go back. The vast majority of the people that I deal with, perfect, have histories of trauma. The vast majority of young men and older men that I deal with incarceration have histories of trauma. Okay. What does it mean to be trauma informed? Well, that's what Reverend Dr. Donna was talking about with restorative practices. We can connect that restorative practice to what it means to be trauma informed. It doesn't mean just taking some classes or doing a webinar like this and, you know, gathering some nice materials and saying, wow, I learned that. As the Honorable Commissioner said, we need to dust it off and look at it often, right? We need to do that often. So first thing is we need to realize how trauma affects people. You all have ample evidence of how it's affecting the young people that you serve and that you are supporting. You need to recognize the signs. We've gone over this in this webinar, many behaviors that are very overt that you can look at and say, wow, that looks like something, right? What do we call it, right? Acting out behavior. No, that's trauma. It's trauma. Responding by changing our practices. We've gotten lots of ideas today about how to change our practices, and we'll have a few more. We need to resist re-traumatizing people. Now, how do you do that? By asking the right question and stop asking the wrong question. The wrong question is, what's wrong with you? And we say that to young people all the time. What's wrong with you? That's not the right question. That's a re-traumatizing question. That's a judgmental question. That is an I already know you're a bad kid question. And then they shut down, not surprising. The right question is what happened? What happened? When you ask that question, you're inviting a person to tell their story. Now, hopefully you have a relationship and credibility with that young person that they will at some point want to share their story. But the reason that they would want to share their story is because of trust, credibility, support, protection, all those things. And so when you think about crisis management, and I took this from one of my business classes because I wanted to connect it to the clinical focus. This is what we don't want to happen in our schools. This is what we don't want to happen in our churches. This is what we don't want to happen in our businesses. Denial. Maybe it will all just blow away, blow over. Anger. How dare anyone criticize my school, my family, my church, my whatever you represent. I'm the victim here. I'm getting all this bad publicity. Bargaining. Please leave our Facebook wall out of it. Somebody had mentioned several times Facebook, parents that have access to it, that have means. And then depression. What will this do to our brand? Now, I love what the attorney said earlier. We have to both care for people that establishing our humanity and practicing our humanity, but we have to be realistic. Yes, you do have to care about your brand. You have to do both. You first have to protect children and safeguard, as Dr. B instructed, but you also have to do what the attorney had talked about earlier, which is we have to put the steps in for crisis management. Crisis management does not start after the crisis. Crisis management, ethical crisis management, starts before there ever is a crisis. By having the advisory board or the advisory group that the Honorable Commissioner talked about, working together, community, across domains, putting in strategies and what we're going to do, not if something happens, but when it happens, and being specific. That's how you protect a brand, as you're also exercising your humanity by protecting children. You have to tell the truth. You have to be transparent about what happened. One of the saddest things that happened to me in Philadelphia is when we were trying to implement suicide prevention programs in our schools. And principal after principal rejected our proposal, saying, we don't want that because we don't want people to think we have a problem with suicide. Excuse me? You don't want people to think you have a problem with suicide? You do have a problem with suicide. That's why we're here. But the principals did not want the publicity of having a suicide prevention program in their school. Now, I know those of you on this call think that's ridiculous, but let me tell you, they were serious. And so we finally got 2 or 3 schools to sign up. And when they saw how effective it was, then slowly but surely, one principal here, one principal there, finally signed up. Crisis management begins before the crisis. It continues when the crisis happens, and you tweak and adjust your strategies. And it continues after the crisis by continually be transparent, continuing to acknowledge the challenges, being very clear with the public and the people who are harmed, what you have put into place to change the system, if that's what the problem is, to add in supports if that's what's needed. And then after the depression, that last point of the cartoon, we accept that our lawyers will draft a heartfelt non-apology. Now, we all get that, right? So this is what we need. And again, I took this from a model that I use in some of my business classes that I teach. And the 5-stage model of crisis, I won't belabor this point. I just want you to have this, and hopefully I'll get an opportunity to go in depth with you later. Signal detection. We went over some of the signal detection that happens in schools and communities. Probing and prevention. That's that starting, having a program before you have the crisis. Damage containment. So it's happened. The worst thing you thought has happened. You acknowledge it, you're transparent about it, and you immediately go into action with your crisis plan. We're beyond the crisis prevention plan. This is a crisis management plan. And understand the difference between crisis management and crisis aversion. Crisis aversion means we stick our head in the sand and act like it didn't happen because we don't want to be sued. And guess what? You end up getting sued anyway. I'm not going to step into the lane of the attorney that was on earlier, but that's what happens. But if we do it right, and we have a plan, and we implement that plan, even if there's glitches and even if it doesn't turn out perfectly, you're going to be given some credit for the fact that you had a plan. You're going to be given some grace. You're going to be given some grace because you did what you knew to do. You implemented what you knew to implement. You brought in experts. You did everything you could to protect children, to protect the brand, the school, and the teachers and everybody involved. Damage containment, meaning not acting like it didn't happen. Damage containment is, let's not allow it to spread like a cancer. Let's contain the damage. If we have a few children who are acting out and going through this because of what happened, let's not make it 35 children. Let's not keep burying it and then recognize that, oh no, it's popping up all over the place now because we did not act. And then once you are containing the damage and you're providing resources and supports, just by doing that, you're supporting recovery. And then what do we learn? What did we learn? You have to look at the learning. The crisis didn't happen in a vacuum. What did we learn? And what can we now implement moving forward to have a better plan the next time something happens? Next slide. And so our communication style is going to be important. And I won't belabor this point either because you'll have this, but the pre-crisis, monitor crisis risk. What are the things that may be going on that are festering in your neighborhood, in your school? Be on top of what's happening in your school. Young people sometimes get together and make pacts. You know, in the United States, we had a big issue for a while. There was suicide pacts. Young people making a pact that the 5 of us, we're going to do this. And adults may have had warning signs that didn't tell anybody, or other students knew that these students were meeting on Facebook or some other social media planning something. Same thing happens with school shootings. What do you know about the environment that your kids are in, the school? Make decisions about how to manage potential crisis. Again, this is a conversation that has to happen ahead of time. The example I give you is this: nobody, no school, no business has a fire drill in the middle of a fire. You ever notice that? People practice fire drills before there's a fire, so that when you do it over and over again, when the fire actually happens, you just go into action. You know where the exits are. You got a plan. It's on the wall. You know where to go. You know what to do. You meet outside. You count the people. Everybody's safe. We're good. It's the same with this crisis management. Be prepared. Do your fire drill before there's a fire. Train people who will be involved in the crisis management process. You should have people at your school, at your organization, who have had the training and who are designated people who you can go to. Okay? Crisis, collect and process information for crisis team decision-making. Dr. B, Dr. Donna, myself, we're big on data. Data informs us. It's not just collecting information. It informs our decisions. Create and disseminate crisis messages. Make sure that the people involved in your organization know what the plan is, know who are the accountability partners are. Post-crisis, you want to assess the crisis management effort, provide follow-up and crisis messages as needed. Keep people informed so that they don't feel like you're hiding anything. Be transparent. Let them know where you are in the steps of processing what has happened and what supports you've put in place to help people. Be upfront. Next slide. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Dr. Jean. And I hope that we have been able to share with you some of our experience. As I told Mrs. Koiki, this is what we do in 3 full day sessions that we're packing into. We planned 90 minutes, we're already 2 hours, but I'm happy we have over 200 people who are hanging out with us. We'll be glad to stay on. My philosophy is that I'm yet to meet a bad child, and I've worked with really tough children over my career here in the US. But I have met far too many of them that they will do really bad damage because these children came from bad situations. So knowing that we are building this together, this is a ship that's being built and being sailing it at sea together for Nigeria. I hope that we would take some of what we learned today. I'm hopeful that you would do this test and know your own ACE score. We are open to, if you want to work with us in terms of collecting data specific for your school, we normally code each of the schools. The questionnaires are anonymous, but you have to answer all the 10 questions. Otherwise, it's a waste. We're automatically rejected. Again, thank you from Reverend Dr. Donna Jones, Dr. Jean Wright, and myself. We will take questions now. One thing I want you to notice is my little mouse. You see, it's so determined to eat that cheese, and he knows he'll be conked on the head, so he's wearing a helmet. I hope that some of the information we share with you will be your helmet to fasten your seatbelt, work hard at getting children healthy, and when they're hurt, be prepared to recognize, refer them for treatment. Thank you so much. The links, we were giving free training on Facebook once a month. I stopped it because we were not getting this, only very few, number was dropping because people were saying, I need to pay for their internet access. I couldn't give you free training and pay for the internet access at the same time, so I stopped it. You can check us on ACES West Africa. That's a platform for Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and all the people we work with along the West Coast. And you can reach me at info@suburbancares. At this point, I'll hand it over to the moderator. We will try to get you the slides and the resources so that you can use it as best as you can. Back to our moderator for today. Thank you.
Wow. What can I say? This was so lavish in content. Thank you so much, Dr. Ogunka and her team. It was beyond us, from the ACs to the government regulation to legal responsibility, restorative practice, and then breaking down the impact of trauma. It was just very, very impactful. Thank you very much. So the time is fast spent, so we're just going to take a few questions. I already have some sent to my phone already. I asked some to post on the chat box. I don't see many there, but I'll go ahead and read this very first one. So it says, question: navigating information received in confidence from children, situations happening real time and situations that happened months ago. What is the responsibility of the adult, school management, and when do we escalate to the government? When do we investigate, involve the parents, and does one happen before the other? So it's a very long question. So
I see that you have like 5 questions in one.
Many questions in one.
If you follow what Dr. Wright just said, pre-crisis, you have to have your fire drills mapped out on the wall, practice, and you know who is doing what. But one thing that is very clear in the Lagos State document is simple. There must be a full-time person whose job is designated as the designated officer for safeguarding and protection. Go back to that document, the forward page 5 is right there, and it states even the responsibilities that they expect. So that's within the school. If your teachers are not trained in trauma, they will miss obvious things. They would things that are normal development for children are sometimes confused as behavior, and some behaviors that are challenging, that's your first flag to say, I'm distressed, are taken as children who are bad. And we're very quick and very judgmental in Nigeria, where we chalk it up to, oh, that's bad parents, the child came from a bad home. I've seen children who were raised well, but want to belong to this group of children doing bad stuff, and they will join them. They forget everything that's said at home. Some who are day students will leave the house in one clothing, but have another one in their bag just to belong to the group. So going back to what do we do now when the crisis occurs? First, you have to learn incident reporting. There are different categories of incident reporting that we can work with you to develop. What are absolute, you must call the state and report. A child is dead. That moment, we don't have full information if we have a child that's dead. A child is missing, it goes straight to the state. We have this problem, we'll give you more information, but there are steps that you have to take to each of those incident reporting. Then there are things like kids fought and there was a big fight in the whole school. Your designated officer and your response team have to now say, okay, what's going on? Find the facts, develop it, write it. And immediately your PTA has to be notified to say, okay, we need to have a meeting with parents. This is what's going on. Your story has to be told by you. Because if it's told by somebody else or by a child who is already frightened of, I did something bad, my parents are going to kill me, they come with their own fabricated story. And before you know it, you're on Facebook, Twitter, name it, and it's all over, all messed up. By the time you now regroup, yes, and the pattern I've seen in the past 6 months is there's this high fire 2 days. I get emails from everybody telling me what happened, and then everything goes dead. Why? Because the school now has finally picked up the pieces, put the facts together, and it doesn't tally with all the nonsense that was written on Facebook. But your brand is already injured. And now you have to pick up the pieces from that point forward. So there's a lot that you have to build in now. And we'll help you to figure that out and come up with documentation and even how to adopt these state documents. It's important you know how to build and have that document. But please, regardless of what we come up with or what you find from other sources, don't put it on a bookshelf behind me. Put it on every corner of the school. Have it e-filed, and every month There must be meetings discussing this with teachers. It must be part of the teachers' meeting monthly. What are we doing on this? You cannot cover everything, but specific areas you're touching. Your pastoral care, your pastoral teachers who get care in the boarding house, everyone must be trauma trained, no exception. If you're going to send your children out, don't leave them with math teacher or science teacher, not because they're not good, but they're not trained in that regard. They're very good in math, but are they good at managing children? You have to support them and have that supporting staff that would be there to help them. I always recommend social workers, counselors, all these people have to be in that loop of training. I hope that answers all the questions, the 5 questions I'm trying to say.
I'm sure it does. Well, and then there's one more. This is just, it says, well, first, I like the fact that you said our story has to be told by us. I cannot agree more, because we change the narrative. We take over the narrative as soon as we start to tell the stories by ourselves. So this one says, why and how do we engage parents in school policy implementation?
Why or how?
It says why and
parents
how.
are involved. This is what happens with Nigerian parenting, and this is my bias. This is what I have seen for many years. When a parent is buying a house or building a house, they're involved in every detail, from the architecture to every brick, every interior design and things. When it's their children, they pay, I paid you, that's your job to figure out the architecture, figure out all this. So they're not involved. They have no idea of how much you have invested in these children. Just let that child cough or sneeze, and then your head had to be chopped off. You have to find a way to bring parents back. And part of your condition for accepting children is you have to be engaged. Yoruba's language, I don't know where we lost it. I've never remembered that piece. For non-Yoruba speaking, the cocoa farmer doesn't dry the cocoa beans and walk away. They're staying there watching it from sun, making sure they move it around, making sure birds are not messing with it, making sure the rain doesn't fall on it. That's the amount of investment we have to have in our children. Being paid to become surrogate parent, which is technically what they have turned you into, is setting you up for failure later. Because now you've taken all that responsibility, trying to impart knowledge, trying to train them, and then you're blamed for everything not working right. So it's imperative that they're involved in developing policies, bring them into committees. You have some parents that are more active than the others, even the non-active one. Require that within a year, we expect you to attend at least 3 PTA meetings. Come and hear what's going on. And if all of you agree together, they're not going to be shopping from one school to the other, because that's the pattern in Nigeria. You say something, you stand your grounds on one, they're moving to the next school. And the sad thing about shipping children around is you do and undo the relationships that they have built. No wonder they're not attached to anybody. They have no feelings about killing somebody or killing anybody else, because they have no secure attachment. And all the friends they have made, all the things that they need to be responsible adults is lost in all that shipping them around. So let's look at what are we doing? What investment are we having in our children? Are we caring more about our chairs and our lawn? I see immaculate lawns, and I can't find the parent for the kid. I wonder, what are we doing? At the end of the day, I think if we invest a little more time, then we're not going to have to deal with problems on the other end.
Okay, so on that note, we'll call it a day. We'll hand over to the chairman, Mrs. Lai Koiki, chairman of APEN, to share her thoughts on the webinar tonight. Mrs. Koiki.
Really, Park, thank you so very much. We've learned so much, but really it can't just stop here, because there's so much to build on. I mean, for us to ensure that these children are safe, Because if they are safe, then we can say that our community will be safe, and we can manage any crisis that may come up, because it's inevitable. There will be crisis at some point in time. And how prepared are we? Now you've given us the tools, what we need to do before. I mean, I like the analogy with the fire drills, that you don't have fire drills when there's fire burning. The fire drills would have happened before then. And so indeed, we need to be prepared even for any crisis that may come up. And so I say very big thank you, for this wealth of knowledge that you've given us, information that you've given us, and we'll continue to build on it. And we'll try and, enhance that relationship as well, so that, many more people can become empowered. Because when we have empowered people within the system, then good things happen in our schools and in our society. So thank you very much, Dr. Bunkwa. Thank you, Dr. Jean Wright. And thank you, Reverend Donna Lawrence, right? Thank you so very much. And Mrs. Ogulewe, thank you so much for your contribution. We really, really appreciate you. Thank you. Even though it was meant to go on for 90 minutes, it's gone on for over 2 hours, and we still have about 200 people on the call. It shows how impactful this has been. Thank you very much.
And thank you to the commissioner for giving us the opportunity and her time to join us at this time. Thank you all thank you for being here, and we apologize for the length it took. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Do not apologize at all. We enjoyed everything. Thank you so much. Even all the comments are very positive in the chat box. Everyone enjoyed it. Thank you so, so much. We're grateful. And like Mrs. Koiki said, it's an ongoing conversation. So we'll just keep it going. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for staying on.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you.
Yeah, they do that.
Thank you. Bye. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Well
Good
done,
night.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you.
night.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, young, yes. Okay, good night then. Thank you. Bye.
Au revoir et bonne nuit.
Thank you.
Just assume that no one. Don't you need a direction? No one goes there. Let's go.